Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 11th of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start today's briefing off with an InFocus. There's a number of things that concern me that I think almost everyone has been watching build over the past 2 weeks or so. And I'm seeing three crises in various stages of development right now. Maybe that turns to four later this summer and fall. We'll start with the first. Domestically, we're all watching these left-wing organizers build up another anti-Trump movement for mass protests and demonstrations that could turn disruptive this summer. They've been predominantly peaceful so far. I've not seen any violence at these nationwide protests so far. Last weekend's Saturday National Day of Protest, I would say, had some limited success. They were able to mobilize somewhere between 3, maybe as many as 5 million protesters nationwide. And that's not nothing. There is another National Day of Protest from the same group that is scheduled for Saturday, the 19th of April. It's next Saturday. And this movement is trying to build a sustained mass protest movement. I doubt that this year is going to be anywhere on the order of 2020, either by size or by intensity. So I think it's going to be smaller. I don't think we're going to have 100 days of rioting this year. I do not see it. But these groups are trying to build a sustained mass protest movement that's going to put additional pressure on Democrats to be more aggressive against the Trump administration, and also put pressure on Republicans to break ties with Trump. Fracturing the MAGA coalition was defined as the strategy following the planning and strategy sessions from November of last year to January of this year. By the way, we have 13 pages of protests coming up this weekend, individual protest events. And so if you'd like access to that, if you'd like to stay on top of where these protests are happening day in and day out, they're happening during the week as well. Just weekends are obviously going to be larger. You need to be paying attention to our protest and riot tracker. You can do that by joining the Early Warning Network over at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. The second crisis that is developing, economically and financially, I would say at this point, there is a confidence crisis that is brewing for the dollar and for U.S. Treasuries. And at this point, the risk of a financial crisis is simply high. This is not just over trade and tariffs, but also over interest rates and Treasury yields. There's a tug of war, game of chicken maybe going on between the Treasury and the Fed. I'll get to that in just a second. But a lot of people are paying attention to the dollar index and this, so far, the Fed's unwillingness to cut interest rates. The U.S. Treasury has to refinance $6.5 trillion of debt in the first half of this year. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent wants to do that, obviously, at a lower rate. The Treasury needs interest rates and Treasury yields to go lower. But the Fed has been unwilling to cut rates because they want to make sure inflation continues trending down, and also because the labor market has actually been holding up, according to the official numbers. So in short, the Fed at this point has been unwilling to cut rates, even though they've been lobbied by Treasury to do that. And I've noticed that several major banks have gone from forecasting 0 rate cuts this year to now expecting 2 or 3 rate cuts. And this is a significant change, especially if the Fed does actually cut rates 3 times this year. I think that's a very important indicator of cracks forming in the economic and financial sectors. Last week, Deutsche Bank warned, beware a dollar confidence crisis. And I do think at this point, just looking at Treasury selling off, dollar selling off, the flight to gold, I do think de-dollarization is happening at some level, because we're hearing from and seeing a lot of foreign investors question whether the dollar and whether Treasuries are still safe haven assets, whether they're going to be a safe haven asset, not just now, but in 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now. Gold continues to rocket higher on these dollar and Treasury fears. Gold is up about 23% so far year to date. The dollar is down about 8% so far year to date. And some investment banks are now forecasting a mild recession starting this year. This has also changed over the past 2-ish weeks. Meanwhile, there is a looming debt ceiling breach potentially as soon as next month. And some Democrats have lamented previously that their party leadership caved on last month's continuing resolution fight. And they appear willing to take this fight on the debt ceiling over the cliff this time because they believe it's going to irreparably damage the Trump administration and hurt the GOP heading into the 2026 midterms. So between this mass protest movement that's being built, and by the way, economic and financial uncertainty is going to at some level, drive more civil unrest. So between the mass protests and potentially a financial crisis and a recession, this summer could be very bumpy. And then the third looming crisis is what's happening between the United States and China right now. Roughly 2,400 years of history says that there's between a 70% and a 90% chance of a military crisis or armed conflict between the United States and China. And I think these are two very reliable indicators. Jared, Robert, and I talked for over an hour yesterday about how likely this is and what form it could take and what that looks like. We're going to continue working on that report and get it out to you early next week. But the two large indicators that I pay attention to, historic benchmarks, if you will, is Graham Allison's Thucydides trap. And he says that about 75% of the time a revisionist power challenges a status quo power, it results in war. So in this case, the revisionist power is China, the status quo power is the United States. 75% of the time, going back to like 450 BC, it results in war. And then another book I've been talking about a lot more recently, Dale Copeland's Economic Interdependence and War, tells us that a military crisis or armed conflict is the result in 90% of the cases when future trade expectations of economically interdependent great powers turn negative, which is now happening between the United States and China. You got country A, you have country B. They do trade with each other. They're economically interdependent. One is a primary buyer. One is a primary seller. They need each other. And when future trade expectations turn negative, either becomes incentivized to start a military crisis. And this is something that China has a long history of doing. When they're backed into a crisis, they can initiate military conflict, crises or conflicts. We did the math. Jared, do you remember the math? China has a major military. We crunched some numbers yesterday and crunched some history. It's like every 8.5 years or so, China has a significant military action.
Yes, and that's since the Communist Party of China took over in 49.
Since 1947 or 49, yeah. Okay, so every 8.5 years. Their last one was, what do we say, 96?
Yep, and end of the Taiwan Strait Crisis number 3 was 96.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. There's also this huge challenge of China's relative ability to take Taiwan is reducing because more and more countries are rearming, more and more countries are coordinating with each other. We're talking about Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, the United States, Australia, numerous countries potentially getting involved in the defense of Taiwan. So this is not something that is going China's way. And if you're Xi Jinping, the question you have to ask yourself really is, are we running out of time to do this militarily? And by the way, we're not even talking about an amphibious invasion. We're talking about a military blockade and encirclement of Taiwan, which China has not only been exercising, they've been rehearsing. They are able to do this. Jared, if you can hop back on just for 1 second. Yesterday, one of our key conclusions, our primary key finding was even a military blockade of Taiwan is likely to result in armed conflict between major parties in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes. And the reason for that is the only way to properly run a blockade around Taiwan basically requires land seizure from the Philippines and Japan, which the moment you break territorial integrity, they have to be involved. They're both treaty allies of the United States. All three of those nations come in, along with likely the rest of the anti-China coalition, which we've talked about and shown several times. It spirals real quickly, and that means China's main vector of attack down in southern Taiwan now becomes directly threatened by the Philippines. So China pretty much has to expand immediately.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is the $1 million $1 trillion question, $5 trillion question is, if you're China, it kind of appears that time is no longer your side. Time is a liability for you as this U.S. Indo-Pacific coalition continues to build, continues to conduct military exercises, talk, coordinate, build military interoperability. And we've seen Japan and NATO conduct military interoperability exercises with Japan, South Korea, and NATO. So not just the United States. So the question is could something happen this year? And I'll tell you this also, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, I mentioned this, I think, earlier this week. He's been very clear that the strategy is to use tariffs not only to economically contain China, but to, I think we've kind of probably figured out here, the overall strategy, as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said, is build this global coalition and, as he said, quote unquote, approach China as a group. So if you're China, are you going to wait around for this, presumably it still exists, for this Western-led global order to impose tariffs on you? And I think that's another reason why we're seeing Xi Jinping he's going to Thailand and some other countries, basically trying to hammer out these trade agreements to prevent this U.S. strategy of engaging these countries to also implement tariffs on China. I think next month there's going to be a big EU-China economic consortium where they're going to try to hammer out some sort of trade agreement. So there's a lot happening at the geostrategic level. But Jared, do you have any, just on the topic of could Chinese military action happen this year? Do you have any closing thoughts here before we move on?
I sent it over to you privately, but yes, I think it's I think it is now or never. They for the next probably 20 to 50 years, they're going to be in an increasingly worse off position. If you're going to do it, it's time.
Because of a demographic crisis.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this window, and Jared, the window for an amphibious assault comes open about twice a year. Mm-hmm. Once in the spring and once in the fall. And that just has to do with weather and water conditions in the Taiwan Strait. But a military blockade and encirclement of Taiwan could literally happen tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, anytime. So that is not weather dependent.
Yeah.
And just
for storms that would break a blockade, but you can pretty easily move, get out of the way of the storm, ride it, and then come right back.
Like a typhoon.
That would technically break the blockades, but it would also prevent running a broken blockade.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just to reiterate, Jared, do you think a military blockade of Taiwan results in armed conflict with Japan and the Philippines? And
absolutely.
And by extension, the United States. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So this could happen potentially this year. All right. Thanks, Jared. These are the three major crises that I think have a very good chance of happening. And then finally, the fourth crisis is we can't discount natural and man-made disasters causing some national crisis. A month or two ago, I was talking with a retired fire chief from California, and I was asking about the California wildfires like in Los Angeles. And he said, almost always, anytime you see multiple fires in the same geographic area, it's arson. And so wildfires are a persistent threat for much of especially the American West. I don't think we can discount the likelihood of sabotage or of asymmetric warfare against the United States. And then also hurricane season comes up every year between June and November. And a catastrophic hurricane could potentially cause some major crisis. So those are the kind of four areas of crises that I'm becoming a lot more concerned about them hitting us this year. With that, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Good morning, Robert. All right, so previously, I guess Peter Navarro has been replaced as the chief negotiator for Team Trump. What's going on?
Yeah, this is according to people who say they're close to the White House, and they're saying that that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is now at the head of President Donald Trump's trade policy team in the White House, and economic advisor Peter Navarro has been sidelined. And they're also saying that the White House has tried to limit Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's public appearances on trade, especially on the Sunday shows. And I think it has to do with his comment about how the U.S. is going to be filled with thousands of people screwing in little screws in iPhone factories. Yeah. But I think it makes sense that Bessent is now at the head of the trade strategy team, because he seems to be the architect of this China containment strategy. And I think, watching some of his stuff during his confirmation hearings, talking about trade, I think he has a much more diplomatic presentation of trade policies compared to Lutnick. But from what I understand, Navarro is just an advisor and didn't have legal authority to negotiate trade deals anyway. And Trump still likes him, so he's not exactly in the doghouse. But this move does make sense. The shakeup makes sense to me, since it seems like the Trump administration is leaning into this containment strategy.
Mm-hmm. I've been thoroughly impressed by Scott Bessent. I will say that, and it's a little more comforting knowing he's taken this over. I think he's far more risk averse than Lutnick or Navarro. All right, and then finally, this is also something we've been talking about since the first major recess of this year, which is Indivisible is primarily was driving this, and now it looks like the whole Democrat Party is getting behind it. But they're planning these people's town halls during the Easter recess, which I think starts today or Monday.
Yeah, the Congress is headed out today, and I think some even left last night from the Senate to head out for the recess. And they're not due back until the week of the 28th of April. And it does look like Democrats are leaning into this town hall strategy, because now, instead of the previous efforts where we've seen like Indivisible and I think Democracy Forward trying to create these viral clips at Republican-held town halls, these Democrats are now going to both GOP and swing seat districts to try to host these town halls. And a few of them are even saying they're inviting the Republican representative from that district. What I think is interesting about this, and where I think they're going to go on this strategy, is that Third Way, which is a group we've talked about a bit, they conducted a polling and a message testing operation in late March that they just reported on recently, and where they published it, which I think the intent to influence this strategy. They said that in their polling, they found 14% of 2024 Trump voters were what they called soft and movable, especially on economic messaging. And they think that Democrats could hammer Trump. If Democrats hammer Trump on the economy and these federal agency reforms in a specific way, especially emphasizing that Trump is firing safety experts, that they could peel off a lot of non-college voters and Trump supporters in the Democrats' attempt to flip these GOP and swing seats in the House. And I think their effort to flip the House especially is going to be boosted by a couple of recent developments we covered, like this Wisconsin Supreme Court election and the possibility that we're facing an economic crisis in the next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I by the way, these investment banks, they're not calling for a deep recession. They're calling for a mild recession. The average recession lasts for 10 months. The midterms are 18 months away. I think there's a case to be made that if we do go through a recession, it is mild, and we do pull out of it by the end of this year, well, say early next year, then there's still a ways to go. We get back to economic growth heading into the midterms. I think the Republicans are in a much better position. If this is a longer recession, it's obviously going to be catastrophic probably for Republicans. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on to our roll-ups. I'll let you just take it from the top here.
So President Trump issued an executive order, and the Trump administration is increasing tariffs on de minimis shipments. Those are the shipments that are normally exempt from tariffs that are valued at $800 or less, and that tariff is going to increase from 90% to 120% starting on the 2nd of May. I think this is relevant directly for our listeners, because if they're trying to purchase anything that's imported from any country that has uses de minimis shipments, not just China but other like Europe and South America, this loophole is going to be closing in the next 30 days. So we're going to see major increases in prices on some of these smaller imports. And then just like California announced last week, now Maryland Governor Wes Moore is saying he's planning a foreign trade and tech delegation to Asia. He said the idea is he wants to forge state level partnerships with foreign trade partners and tech companies and try to get foreign direct investment. And I think we could see more blue states, more Democrat controlled states start to do this, even though they are legally limited on what kind of agreements they can actually make. But I think in this case, Moore is also expected to be preparing a 2028 presidential run. And this is like Newsom, this is an attempt to boost his national level profile and show that he has some foreign policy bona fides.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. Thanks for staying on top of that. Let's move over to Jared now for our global sit rep roll up. Go ahead, Jared.
So we're going to start off with the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They announced that they would not retaliate against the U.S. tariffs overnight. Now, as you mentioned, China is doing a diplomatic sprint, trying to get anybody they can to participate in retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. They announced they were going to go to ASEAN, and ASEAN saying, we're not doing that. We are prioritizing the U.S. Just like we saw with South Korea and Australia, these are small nations. These ones are actually in China's backyard. Several of them have open territorial disputes with China that are active. One of them is the Philippines. They're prioritizing security. They're making it known. This is, again, telling China, you're on your own. We're not dealing with it anymore. Speaking of the Philippines just took delivery of its first Miguel Malvar class frigate and is projected to receive the next one later this year. What that's going to do is double the Philippines frigate capacity. Now, this is not a lot, but relatively, that's big for the Philippines. This does allow them to effectively have a constant frigate presence, which is going to be the most in the South China Sea, which is going to be the most powerful ship there, unless the Chinese Navy sends like a destroyer. Now, this also gives them flexibility to potentially surge and provide a surface warfare and anti-warfare combatant to help break a blockade, because you can maintain the South China Sea, their primary security threat, while helping that. This is big. Quite frankly, it is very big that they now have that flexibility. Moving over.
Jared, I just want to point out something. Is it correct now that the Philippines has more frigates than the United States Navy? Because the Navy has 0, right?
Yeah, the Navy has 0, but the Philippines already had 2. They delivered in 20 and 21, and now they're getting 2 more. They have far more than we do. Mm-hmm. One thing we've talked about, the interplay between the U.S. Navy and the defense architecture it's built with the allies. The fact that our allies do tend to be a frigate-based Navy rather than a destroyer or carrier-based Navy does somewhat fill that gap, though it is not as good as if the U.S. Navy had its own dedicated frigates. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. Navy knows that. That's why it's constantly trying to renew them. Failed with the LCS program. It's trying with the Constellation class. We'll see how that goes. Yeah. Moving over to Europe, kind of. The UK's HMS Prince of Wales, one of their carriers, is leading a carrier strike group composed of British, Canadian, and Norwegian ships to an Indo-Pacific deployment. This CSG is going to conduct multi-carrier ops in the Mediterranean. That's actually very important. What that's doing is preparing for Europe to maintain its own security in the Med, but also practice for multi-carrier ops over in the Pacific, which we've seen tri-carrier ops several times over the past couple of years. And I got to participate in one before I left in 2017, which was awesome. Now, that this CSG is also going to transit the Red Sea, probably going to participate at least in shipping lane defense for a little bit. And I think this is important because it shows that even though the EU is talking a big game economically, they're still committing strategic level assets to our primary security theater. And lastly, Iran. So Iran's president announced that the Ayatollah is open to American investment in Iran as long as there is no infiltration by spies or saboteurs. And their primary negotiator for tomorrow's talks, the foreign minister, is going to conduct the talks with these instructions in hand.
Okay. Interesting. CIA uses these business officials all over the world to conduct espionage and information gathering. I don't see how that's possible, but I guess we'll see. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move over to our warning items. Excuse me. Starting with these sanctuary cities, Robert.
Yesterday, President Donald Trump said he's planning some new actions to withhold all federal funding from these cities and states with sanctuary immigration policies. And we've seen a resurgence in one of the organizing pillars of the Trump resistance has been the sanctuary cities. I think Michelle Wu, who is the Boston mayor, and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson have really been taking a national level lead on this. And these sanctuary city and state policies have significantly expanded since Trump's first term. And this map is from the Center for Immigration Studies. You can see that this now includes many cities and counties in Republican-controlled states. And I think the Trump administration sees threats of cutting off this federal funding as a pressure point against these Democrat-controlled states and local governments and these red states, sanctuary cities and counties. Because I've been seeing over the last couple of months, since the end of 2024, a lot of these states and cities have been warning about budget shortfalls, major budget shortfalls in the billions of dollars. But the Trump's previous attempt to do exactly this did see a legal challenge, but we didn't get a Supreme Court decision on it because it happened right before the 2020 election, and the Biden administration rescinded that order before the Supreme Court could actually issue a ruling on it. But I expect that depending on how the Trump administration actually goes about cutting off this funding, the Supreme Court, I think, would side with the Trump administration on this, because the only cases I could find where the Supreme Court blocked this was when I think the Obama administration tried to withdraw already appropriated federal funds to these cities over Medicaid in 2012. Otherwise, most of the legal precedent, I think, is on Trump's side to actually cut off this funding in the future.
Okay. And we're looking at this map here of sanctuary cities, counties, and states. Is that true? Is North Dakota, they can't possibly be a sanctuary state?
Well, the Center for Immigration Studies, they based this not off of openly available information about what these cities and states have done, but off of ICE documents where they basically list off areas that have not cooperated with turning over illegal immigrants who've been arrested to ICE before they're released.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then last kind of question here, Robert. These, as you point out, these cities have faced budget shortfalls. The states have faced budget shortfalls as wealthy people have left their states over these high taxes. With federal funding cuts, this is going to put these cities and states in an even more dire situation. What do you see as kind of the second order impacts here? Is cuts to law enforcement, what's going to be cut?
Well, there could be cuts to law enforcement. I think that's one of the major things I said at the beginning of the year that I think is a major issue that I'm concerned about over the next couple of years is this withdrawal of municipal law enforcement, state law enforcement from areas that we could see an expansion of some of these transnational criminal organizations. That's really bad out, from my understanding, really bad out in West and up in the Northeast with Chinese triads. But I also saw that there are some states, including like Kentucky, which has some of these sanctuary cities, that they're considering lowering their state income taxes because they're saying that there are people leaving these states, and they're trying to incentivize people coming back by lowering state income taxes.
Mm-hmm. It seems okay. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like that's going to put these states in even worse situation. So, all right, we'll see. Thanks for Robert for staying on top of that. Let's move over to this. Robert, you've been covering this, the Colorado River water sharing agreement, this treaty we had with Mexico going back to 1944?
Yes.
Mexico has not upheld their end of the bargain, and now Trump is, what are they going to dam the Colorado River? What are they going to do?
So the Trump administration is considering levying sanctions and additional tariffs on Mexico over this, because Mexico has been, for roughly the last year, shorting water deliveries. Mexico maintains that they're meeting the treaty obligations because it's over a 5-year timeline. They have to have so many acre feet of water that they give to these states as part of the sharing agreement. But Mexico has also been dealing with its own water crisis, and I think it was at the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024, there was actually concern that drinking water, the main drinking water source for Mexico City, was going to run out of water. And the shorter deliveries, though, I think could have a major impact on water security for states that are reliant on this Colorado River basin, because, like you said, they are still fighting over water distribution. And I think the next water sharing agreement for the states is due up in 2026. And there have been points in the last 2 years where key parts of this basin, like Lake Mead, have been close to what's called a dead pool water level, which would stop downriver flow that would impact not just drinking water and agriculture, but even hydroelectric power in these western states. So this is a major concern, I think, for the Trump administration, especially if this is going to hit agriculture and power, which has been two major policy focuses of the Trump administration.
All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here to, I think Jared's up next. All right, Jared. During our talk, by the way, we did record most of that talk, and we may put it up on the Early Warning Network for members if you want to watch kind of as we talked through this, as we talked through the intelligence challenge of understanding what a blockade would look like in the second and third order effects. If you're interested in that, let me know, and we can put that recording up on the app for Early Warning Network members. Jared, one of the things we talked about is how long could China run this blockade of Taiwan, considering their oil imports would be cut off? I'll say virtually cut off. What's your estimate on that?
So my estimates are at least 3 months, but no more than 6 months. Now, I get to this based off of the U.S. Energy Information's estimates on China using about 16 million barrels a day in 2023. China's been it's only started construction on its SPR in 2005.
Its own strategic petroleum reserve.
Yes.
Okay.
And its last public announcement on this strategic reserve was in 2009 with an intent to get to 90 days by 2020. So really not that long ago. Now, the last published large capacity enhancement was in 2007, and this was for adding 200 million barrels in capacity by 2011. So a 4-year construction period. Using the baseline for what does China need, bare minimum, Taiwan is mandated by law to have 90 days of fuel on hand. Cool. They need at least 90. China needs 90 days on hand as well at a minimum. That's 1.4 billion barrels. If they want to achieve 6 months in order to outlast any kind of extra that Taiwan would have, which keep in mind, they could do extreme rationing because this is a matter of existentiality for them. Prepare for 6 months. Well, that's 2.9 billion barrels of oil on hand. At the rate they'd have to construct, I don't think they could do that. That amounts to adding 145 million barrels of capacity every single year, including this year. And their last main construction project was a 4-year time period for a little bit more than that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's somewhere between 3 and 6 months.
Okay. That's interesting. I think that's a really good starting ballpark. What about China's ability? Well, there's 2 points here that I would bring up. Back in 2022, I talked to an oil trader based in Houston, and he said China's buying so much oil, we have no idea. We don't even know where they're putting it. They're buying more oil than they have known storage capacity. So obviously, China has built underground storage somewhere. I'm sure CIA and NRO and these other people, I'm sure they know where they are. But so this is just based off public numbers. This would not include maybe like more clandestine or secret storage facilities, number one, correct?
Yes. Okay. This is, and the map here, by the way, these are announced, this is where we plan to put them. A lot of these don't even have numbers attached for what they intend to have. And there is a private sector as well, but you're talking about a couple million here, a couple million there, not enough for a full day.
The second thing is back when we had that oil crisis where the price of oil technically on the markets went negative, a lot of oil was actually stored in tankers. And so have you seen anything about China's ability just to have floating storage, to have these oil tankers that are owned by China, they're owned by Costco, or they're owned by whatever Chinese commercial shipping company, and they just sit in a harbor somewhere?
I have not, but if you look at the map, and some of these were already built by the time this map would have been created, yeah, they probably have some sitting in the harbor right next to their main storage capacity, because you've got Dalian, Shanghai, basically you have all these major ports that are already their SPR spots. It would make sense to have an oil tanker sitting there with oil as well.
Okay. All right. And then another thing we talked about yesterday is it's almost certain that the Malacca, Suda, and Lombok Straits are going to be shut down. And these are the channels through which, the straits through which China gets 80%, something like that, of its oil imports. So we're kind of under the key assumption here that China would get virtually zero oil imports, except for whatever they could send in by land. I'm not sure if the Port of Gwadar is going to come into play, if they can. I don't know how cost effective it is to ship oil up through Pakistan and into China, especially since that's coming in through China's west and need it in China's east. It just does not seem entirely feasible to me. So, Jared, I think the major conclusion we came to yesterday is that this actually does not look very good for China. The prospect here,
yeah. There are a couple of factors that leave things to be, to allow the window to widen in both ways. It could be lower. One thing we don't know, this is all talking about maximum possible capacity. Your friend talking about, oh, they're buying so much. Well, we don't know what they started with. If they had zero but an enormous amount of capacity, well, now they're scrambling to try to get almost 3 billion barrels of oil in reserves. And at the same time, can they reach a year? Because Taiwan's food can reach a year, and it's existential. They could just say, look, guys, we're not going to run an economy because we need every drop of fuel for the war effort. So stand by, we'll bring you food. And that could stretch those legs a lot longer than 90 days. Not even talking about running the blockade, which is going to help with that, because they only need 1 billion barrels of oil a day to operate.
All right. Well, Jared, can you give me the bottom line? What's your bottom line assessment on the likelihood that China does move on Taiwan this year as opposed to 2027 or later?
I think it's 50% chance. It's a coin flip. Just because they have no time, but basically they have no other options. Everything else looks like it's heading on a downturn for China, and military action is basically the only thing that has any possibility of success. They have to go in very violent, but it's not likely they win that either.
Yeah. All right. So, I don't see China as having a lot of good options. It seems to me the way they're pursuing is diplomatic. They have to, and we haven't even gotten to sanctions. We have not even gotten to Western sanctions against China for military action on Taiwan. So it seems to be like the coalition building against China has been so far a winning strategy. All right, thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on here to our last item. Speaking of tariffs, China raised tariffs this morning up to 125% on the United States. We're waiting word, I guess, from the Trump administration. Are we going to 400% tariffs, Jared?
I don't know. That's probably more of a question for Robert. I would think if we just incrementally get up there, like, oh, well, you want to do 125? We'll do 150, and then now we ended up in the auction scenario. Anyway, yes, China announced 125% tariffs this morning. At the same time, President Xi called on Europe to fulfill their international responsibilities, safeguard globalization, all the things you would expect, the full quotes here. And they filed a lawsuit with the World Trade Organization against the United States for tariff hikes. There's a couple of big things that are coming out of this. First, I don't think the call for the EU to hop on with China is going to go anywhere, because we've already seen deteriorating relationships between Europe and China as a whole for several years. We've been documenting them. And we still have to see what comes out of this Ukraine finding Chinese troops in Ukraine. Like, that that there's no way that does not play in. We have to figure out where this is going to go, because that could actually, I think, significantly worsen the EU's relationship. At the same time, with China calling on the EU, what that tells me is that they're having trouble implementing economic pain on the United States by themselves. So I think they're probably on the back foot economically, which most people would probably expect. And it doesn't look good for China again. It just plain and simple does not. Also, the WTO lawsuit, I don't expect the U.S. to follow any non-favorable ruling.
Yeah, no, I think the WTO is a non-entity at this point. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and get to some of your questions. Jared, if you can tee up those questions for us, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. We had a slew of them right at the beginning. Here we go.
All right, with the trade policy action, there's a lot of obscure economic levers to be used to conduct economic warfare, like stock manipulation, bond markets, etc. Odds of this spiraling out of control. I would tell you my big concern actually is that too little, too late in terms of the confidence crisis in the dollar and treasuries. I've been previously cautiously optimistic. I think I said that, well, I mean, we saw it earlier this week. Trump said, okay, no new tariffs into effect except on China. Everyone gets a 90-day reprieve for us to hammer out these trade deals. And I think also traders and investors, they've been looking for the Fed to step in and calm markets. My general sense is that the odds of this spiraling out of control are higher, and this is the most concerned I've been obviously since the beginning of the year. I can't tell you. If I could tell you what the actual likelihood was, I'd be working at Goldman or something. So I don't know, but I would say we're officially on financial crisis watch. If it is not, again, maybe the Trump administration and the Fed has done too little, too late, and maybe we already are in this confidence crisis. It's funny because a week or two ago, we started hearing these banks talk about potential de-dollarization, these foreign countries moving away from the dollar. And it appears that's what some of them have been doing. I think a lot of people have been selling treasuries and selling their dollars and buying gold. And you look at the price of gold and it continues to skyrocket, and the dollar index continues to go down. And I think that is what's happening. That's not good, because traditionally the dollar and treasuries have been safe haven assets. And if people really are doubting the future strengths of the dollar and the stability of the U.S. Treasury markets, that's bad for the entire. We're talking about the collapse of the entire global financial system. And if that were to happen, where do you go? Of course, you go to gold. So I think that's probably what's happening. All right, next question. If or when there is a Chinese Communist Party collapse, should the West turn their attention towards India as a future threat, since they harbor resentment towards the West, just like the Chinese? You know, that's something, Jared, I think we talked about earlier this week. I think just between us. And India is aspirational. Their foreign minister, S, I guess he goes by S because no one can pronounce his first name, but his last name is Jaishankar. And this is not exactly what he's been talking about, but he's been talking about India becoming a world power. India supplanting China for a lot of manufacturing as the tech hub of the world. Of course, there's this massive Indian diaspora all over the world, especially in Canada and the United States. And I don't know, what do you think are the prospects for India becoming the next China?
I think they're pretty good. I think that probably is the next geopolitical threat, but there is one very significant different factor. If we are talking about a post-CCP collapse, that means China is no longer a threat for regional hegemony, and it also means we just did India a big favor by shutting down that border crisis. So I think it would be a lot easier to handle that peaceably than it would to have it spiral into war, like it appears the U.S.-China relationship is headed toward.
Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of people suppose that India jumps into this U.S. Indo-Pacific coalition against China in a potential World War III scenario. That's what some people say. I kind of don't see that. I don't think they will need to, and of course I don't think they want to expend any more treasure or blood than is absolutely necessary, you got to preserve that for what comes after China, I guess. All right. Yeah, good question, Jonathan. Next is, without prejudice of whether Trump's economic policy is good or bad, is the resulting economic turmoil in China an accelerant of initiation of kinetic Yeah, okay, so yeah, we've kind of answered that. I would just say I look at history to form a baseline, and a baseline is a really great starting point. It is not everything. But again, history, roughly 2,400 years of history says China has between a 75 and 90% chance of initiating a military conflict or a military crisis or armed conflict. And that could start as soon as this year. I do think Trump's economic policy is accelerating that, yes. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been very clear. He said it on the Tucker Carlson show, which I've talked about multiple times now. He said China is trying to export their way out of a recession. He said, quote, "We can't let them do that." So this is very clear. The United States is at economic war with China. And so I think that is exactly what's happening. If China cuts off medicines or precursor chemicals to U.S. pharmaceuticals, what action do you expect the U.S. to take? Well, that's a great question. Back in, I'll tee Robert or Jared up for this, but back in I think it was 22, I had this talk with Ross Kennedy. Apparently, he's now an advisor of the Commerce Department. And one of the things he said is that if China really wanted to kill millions of Americans, they'd just stop shipping precursor chemicals to these pharmaceutical manufacturers who make life-saving drugs for Americans. Robert, there's been a lot of talk about moving that critical pharmaceutical manufacturing back to the United States or back to Mexico or back to somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. That does not happen overnight. A stoppage could happen overnight. What do you see?
Well, I have seen, I think I said this previously, that there are some of these drug makers have been talking about reshoring since the beginning of the year and looking at bringing supply chains back to the U.S. I think if we saw an immediate pause, the first thing the Trump administration is going to do is what the Biden administration did after the hurricane in North Carolina, Helene, and start trying to lean on other trade partners outside of Asia for this. And we do get a lot of drugs from Europe. As far as spending amount, I don't think percentage they're higher than China or India, but I think that's what what the Trump administration would do is try to lean on these other countries in the short term to make up as much of that shortfall as they could, while these drug makers are currently working on reshoring their manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. Any timeline? I don't know how quickly this takes to stand up, but we're talking about building factories taking years, 5-10 years. I don't know. Any indication on how long this is going to take?
I haven't seen any of these drug makers say what their timelines are, but yeah, I would expect years. I would expect at least a couple of years to actually get that underway and producing. I think there's also one aspect to this is that we have basically mothballed medical production facilities, like in U.S. companies that went from manufacturing to importing just because the margin was better. So those factories the ones that are currently producing medical goods that we rely on imports for, could just turn back on manufacturing, even if they're not as profitable. And we could see some of these mothballed production facilities brought online. I don't think that would immediately replace all of our import reliance from Asia and especially China, though.
All right. Well, this seems to be a worst case scenario, and there is obviously some chance U.S.-China trade relations do go off the deep end, and we do have a sudden catastrophic decoupling rather than a de-risking over time. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on. What backdoor controls does China have on U.S. critical infrastructure? Robert, you've been covering the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon? Yeah, so, I mean, guys, I remember at my old job when I was an intelligence analyst, I got out of that in 2012. I remember reading reports about Chinese cyber access to critical infrastructure. And even back in 2012, I mean, without obviously going into detail, even back in 2012, there were concerns that China could press a button and flip the switch essentially on the power grid. That was 2012. So, Robert, briefly, what do you make of this?
Well, as far as critical infrastructure, they don't have to have backdoor controls. I think they basically, what we've seen over the last couple of years, it's now much more openly said that they have infiltrated most of our critical infrastructure, and they could conduct a massive cyber attack if they thought that that was a way to deter the United States. I don't think it would. I think it would actually accelerate an armed conflict between the U.S. and China. But backdoor systems, I think they would have much more of that in our logistics and our supply chains because of things like those ZPMC made port cranes that are 80% of the market, including inside the United States. And that combined with some other vulnerabilities to our supply chains, like the federally mandated mileage trackers on trucking that are internet connected, that are Wi-Fi enabled, they could conduct something like that, a major cyber attack using that port crane backdoor and follow-on attacks on supply chains to really grind U.S. supply chains to a halt.
Yeah, obviously a risk. I think the conclusion we came to yesterday was anything that causes casualty, any cyber attack that causes casualties, the Trump administration almost certainly treat that as an act of war. So I think this is somewhere that China also has to be concerned about reprisals. For a long time, China did not publicly acknowledge any kind of U.S. cyber meddling or cyber exploitation or cyber attacks within China. We know they've been happening. And only back in 2022 or 2023, did they start publicly acknowledging the United States actually conducting cyber attacks against China or cyber exploitation against China maybe in retaliation. So there's obviously some level that the United States can reach out and touch China. I think they would have to be concerned about that as well. All right, thanks. Maybe less concerned than the United States. But all right, thanks, Robert. Next question. It may be now or never for China to make their move. How would you assess their readiness? How do you assess our readiness? That's definitely a Jared question. Jared, you've been paying attention to the People's Liberation Army Navy for your entire time here at Forward Observer, so / early warning. What do you make of Chinese readiness? I think you're on mute.
I sure am. Sorry, the kids are off school today. Trying to make sure you guys don't hear the background noise. So I don't think they're ready. I don't think they think they're ready because they set a 2027 military readiness timeline to invade Taiwan. But if the goalposts move for what readiness actually means, this is probably still their best shot. Now, as far as our readiness, I like to look at it as a whole picture because you can't move on Taiwan without allies. So is the overall allied force ready? About as ready as they're going to be in the immediate term, but they're getting more and more ready pretty much every quarter. I mean, we're expecting Balikatan later this month to see some weapons shipments just not come back to the U.S. Like we were talking about that with the Nemesis systems.
Yeah, and just to explain, we're talking about moving military assets into the theater for military exercise and then leaving them there as a pre-positioned stock program, essentially.
Yes, that's what the U.S. Army did with the Typhoon missile system, which is a land strike and anti-ship capable and anti-air capable mobile truck mounted missile launcher. So it's like we know that we're doing it. We expect it.
All right, let's get to the last few questions here. Pick some good ones, Jared.
Oh.
Yes, we will be posting. Actually, we just finished. We got it looking pretty. So yeah, we will publish this list of areas, products, industries that are going to be most highly impacted by Chinese tariffs or a trade cutoff potentially with China.
Yep. This one's about, hey, why is Taiwan not just putting anti-ship missiles everywhere? In short, they are. And we've covered some of their drones, which will also help with that. And they're a lot pricklier than what they look like normally. And any word on
the porcupine strategy?
Yeah.
All right. Any word on rebuilding our SPR? It seems like, $60 barrel in oil is a really good time to refill our SPR. Jared or Robert, do we have any numbers on that?
Last I saw, the DOE is explicitly trying to fill the SPR. I think they asked for $20 billion last month. And they're trying to stop any congressionally mandated sales. And they just announced, I think a few weeks ago, a new management contract for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So there, as far as I see, the Trump administration is working on refilling the SPR.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. Final question, Jared. Given China's history of taking a very long view, what's the chance they'll just use this as an opportunity to regroup and try again later? So, Jared, this is the kind of the unknown. Is what I think we pretty much settled. China has roughly 4 national imperatives, we believe. And number 1 is maintain internal stability, internal political stability, maintain economic stability, degrade U.S. power and influence on China, and then Rick Perry moment. I forget what the 4th one was, but it was also important. These are national security imperatives. These are things that China does not want to violate. The question is, I think we pretty much settled yesterday on military action on Taiwan, to include just a military encirclement and blockade, will create effects that violate those national security imperatives. So to what level is Xi Jinping willing to risk his own political stability, their economic stability, because we're talking about sanctions as well, we're talking about blockades of China. The mandate of heaven, not lose or maintain national prominence, I think was probably the 4th, national security. If this is something that they lose, then we're talking about a violation of all 4 national security imperatives on this. How do you think Xi Jinping views those risks?
I think those risks are very, very high. And as far as a long view of conquest, can't do it, because the CCP set a timeline for a total rejuvenation by 2049. They start entering
their 100-year anniversary.
Exactly. They start entering their demographic decline in 2030, roughly. They're kind of already in it, but it gets really bad in 2030. And you can't take the long view, because now you have about a 20-year window where things really can't happen, and there's not really a sign that their demographics are going to improve. At the same time, what that really means, they're militarily getting weaker over the next 2 decades. Just they won't have the bodies, and everybody else, they're not necessarily going to go down at the same time
through unmanned vessels in AI.
Potentially,
because you don't need 100 pilots to fly fighter jets. You need a drone swarm.
So potentially, yes. I am hesitant to say that that's necessarily going to happen, because they'll need to maintain their economy and output for basically everything, while also increasing their drone output at the same time that everybody's starting to cut them off. So production is going to be a lot harder for them as well. And the longer you wait, the more effective drone warfare becomes. People like to point out the swarms. The Navy's been dealing with swarms for decades, that like you just use missiles. There is a swarm tactic there. Swarm tactics have already got a baseline counter. It's just a matter of figuring out how it applies to drone warfare. That if you want to say, oh, well, they have to just increase production and then go forward with unmanned vehicles, fine. But how do they account for the quality of warfare in that time? And I don't think they can. I think there will be an anti-drone swarm tactic already developed, because we're already starting to see that come out. The whole Atlantic strike group that we just covered heading over to the Pacific, they started off with, okay, how do we do anti-drone warfare? This is a 1-year-old problem, and they're already starting to solve it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. We'll end with this last question here. Jared, can you help find that? Ben T had a question about John Adams. The John Adams quote, basically, that the Constitution was made for a moral people. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely outside the purview of what we talk about on this show, but a moral and religious people is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem that we have in this country, is that the Constitution was made for a certain group of people with a certain shared culture, a nation, if you will, people with a shared ancestry and language, common identity. And the further you move away from that shared ancestry and common identity, the less the Constitution, less Constitution's applicability may become. I mean, we got people here who, at any rate, the United States has just been importing a lot of people who they have no connection. This goes back to Sir John Glubb's Fate of Empires. You know, this is the last thing I'll say, and we'll end the show. He published this back in the 1970s. It's an essay, really. It's a 20 or 30 page read. You can read it in, not long. And Sir John Glubb's Fate of Empires, he talks about the cycle of empires. And what he says is that you have this outburst phase because you have a new idea or new technology or new leader that unites people towards a common goal, and they start to grow and they're successful. And they not only do they defend their territory, but now they start to conquer other territory because their population's growing. Kind of survival of the fittest here. And then you get into the age of pioneers, and the more territory you conquer, now you've got the larger landmass you have to protect. So now you have to grow your military, and the more land you have, the more access to resources you have. And now you've got to build trade routes with your trade partners. And now you need a larger military to go and protect those trade routes. And then the society just builds steam until they get to the age of intellect. And the age of intellect is the final phase of an empire. And Glubb talks about mass migration or mass immigration is one of those hallmarks. Frivolity is one of those hallmarks. Defensiveness, pessimism. Glubb has probably like 10 or 12 different characteristics that happen in this final phase of empire. And what happens is Sir John Glubb's, his whole thesis is empires last, on average, about 250 years or 10 generations. And the generation part is very important because his point is the farther a current generation is removed from the original founding of that empire, the less attached they are to it, the less zeal they have to it, the less that is part of their identity. And so if you have a large portion of this country who do not have an identity that was founded in 1776 or back in the 1600s when their ancestors got here, if they have no connection to 1776, then they've got no connection to the founding principles of this entire country. And I think that's become the problem. And Sir John, and this is not politically correct to say, but Sir John Glubb points this out. Lots of people point this out. I think it's exactly what's happening. And all right, good way to end the show. All right, everyone, thanks so much for your support. That's going to do it for not only today, but also for this week. As a reminder, if you'd like access to our reports, by the way, the show stops, and then the commentary over on the Early Warning Network platform starts. We have a community sharing information and perspectives, sharing key data points and information as we try to make sense of where this country's headed and what comes next. If you'd like to be a part of that, we invite you, head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Come join us, start a free 7-day trial. If you don't like it, you can leave. Most people do like it. And with that, everyone, have a great weekend. We'll be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time Monday morning. Until then, be well and stay out front.